All right, you're welcome right back to Africa Business Radio. Winston is still in the studio with you guys, and of course,
I've got Rachel. I've got Rachel. Just say that. I've got Rachel in the studio. I'm right here.
Rachel with me as well. She should never leave. She's here. She's
all
here.
right.
Don't be scared. All right, so we did introduce the topic at the start of the show. Mm-hmm. We almost got carried away because it's actually a very big one, very important, significant for too many reasons, right? And now it's time to really dissect and get into it. Again, if you're just tuning in, we're talking the impact of internet shutdowns.
Something very peculiar in Africa.
Right. Always Africa. Why? Why do I always have to be at that corner?
If you ask me.
Right. Very good one. But this would be an interesting conversation, and we won't be alone. We have some interesting, great guests joining us as well, right? IDC spokespersons. We will be joined by Jonathan Tullett, who is the research manager, IT services for IDC Sub-Saharan Africa, and of course Francis Hook, who is regional manager for IDC East Africa. So we'll be dissecting the impact of internet shutdowns and just looking at a lot of critical talking points as this is concerned.
That's right. So major African countries have had to go through this whole saga of having internet being shut. And according to the government, they always say it's due to security reasons. And the big question is it worth it considering the cost of this particular move by the government?
Absolutely. And
big question is, isn't there any regulation at all? Is it something that they can just do at will and, get back to normal and, get to go back to what it was like before? Is it that easy to just cut off the internet access and when it comes back on, everything goes back to normal? That's
why I said earlier, if you ask me, I'd say it is total abuse of power.
Censorship.
Because and then so the thing is, a lot of these dictators try to say, it's for the interest of the country, national security and the likes, but hey, it's never done right. I mean, things go on in Africa, crazy things happen, and there are no consequences. So I think that's the problem. No accountability. We just go back to normal like nothing happened, which shouldn't be. It's you shut down the internet. Businesses suffer. People can't trade, people can't do anything, people can't do financial transactions, and then you just bring it back and say, it's fine, and nobody pays for that. So it just boils down to, arbitrary use of power. And then another reason, which is something you had asked earlier, why the UN is careful with intervening in things like this is there's a thin line between, great interventions, no matter how good the intention is, and, a threat to sovereignty. That's what they'll always say. So,
Now, talking about the cost of internet blackout, talking about the cost, just a quick survey of what has gone down in some African countries. Let's start with Sudan, for example. Sudan lost about $1 billion in June 2019 when there was a shutdown for nearly a month. And that amount is about 1% of the country's GDP.
Wow.
You can imagine, for a month. And in December 2018, there was an internet shutdown in DRC, and that's estimated to cost about $3 million per day.
See that?
Now, that's not all. In January,
it's more.
All African countries now. In January 2019, in Zimbabwe, they lost about $5.7 million each of the 6 days that access to internet was unavailable. These are countries that hardly have these monies that are being wasted.
It's ridiculous if you ask me. And again, it's always Africa. And also,
Jonathan Tullett is the research manager, the IT service for IDC Sub-Saharan Africa. And then Francis Hook is the regional manager, IDC East Africa. Of course, would have loved to start a conversation with IDC and what they are about. Before we get into the conversation proper about internet shutdowns in most African countries this morning, I'm hoping to get a response from our guest. Still quite shaky. I can't seem to hear them at this point. But we'll just keep the conversation going up until we can get to communicate. We're really sorry about this on and off in this conversation. You know, you were saying.
Yes. So I was saying that, and the thing is, it's always in Africa where we actually need these things to work properly. And just for clarity, right, a clear definition of an internet shutdown is an intentional disruption of internet-based communications, rendering them inaccessible or effectively unavailable for a specific population, location, or mode of access, often to exert control. So you see the keywords over the flow of information. So now, internet shutdown is not the same as, limiting or restricting access to selected apps. So that's different. That you could say that's censorship. You could say, okay, maybe people put fake information. Let's try and filter what comes out. Yeah, but when you totally shut down the internet, that is abuse. Totally.
And the thing is, these disruptions in internet access, even though they happen in one country, it goes to affect some other countries.
Right.
Why is that? We have infrastructures, service providers in these countries who say, okay, we can no longer deal with this disruption. And we see them moving their infrastructures away from that country. It's going to affect their business. It's going to affect the business of the business in that country, and maybe the parent business in whatever country they are coming from.
Right.
So the country, if they've lost infrastructure, they've lost money.
Exactly. So that's why I would never understand it. It is counterproductive in every sense.
In every sense.
You are losing. So what that does is, it's not a conducive environment. It's a toxic atmosphere. Do you get me? So when you have that, it's almost the same as having insecurity on the rise. I will not come to your country and invest and bring millions of dollars or euros or pounds when you cannot guarantee the safety of my staff, for example. So that's it. So if I have a situation where, especially as a tech provider or as an internet provider, you're making it difficult for us to work, and then I know that you can shut down my service at any time for as long as you wish, because of selfish reasons, because you're trying to exert control or control the flow of information, then I don't think I would want my business to stay in your country for too long.
So we see it affecting people in that space and businesses. But the big question is, do these shutdowns really work? Because governments will say we're trying to calm people down. We're trying to make sure we control misinformation. We're trying to make sure that the electoral processes are followed. We're trying to make sure that, there's no, what am I going to call it now, disruptions in the political process. But does it really work, at calming things down? And as you said earlier, they are counterproductive sometimes. In fact, most times they are.
All the time,
because you see people who have had to deal with not having internet access.
Right.
I think you'd find more social unrest in areas like that.
Yes, true. Also, another very important thing to note is the fact that, again, it is mostly done for selfish reasons. If, for example, so let's go back to Uganda, right? Now, you do not shut out international observers or election observers. That's not even done, because people should observe and just be sure that, this process is entirely transparent. So when you block that out, what are you hiding? Why are you doing this? It means that you're not creating a level playing field. So that's not an election. That's blatant rigging. You get me? And when you totally shut down the internet access, don't forget, it is not just saying, oh, you know what, this is for national security purposes. You are affecting specific sectors. You talk about financial services, right? People have to do payments. There are international and local payments and transactions that are heavily dependent on internet access, including those, accessed via mobile apps. So I can't do transfers. I can't send money to my little brother or cousin who's starving, or maybe even in the hospital. Because the government shut down the internet. So it is. I can't even wrap my head around it. I hate to use these terms, but I think it is really, really primitive.
I think it is too. I mean, in general, such restrictions should be avoided completely. And in cases where you say, okay, it's an emergency, we need to shut things down. Let's go back to what happened on January 6th at the Capitol in the US, right? Despite everything that happened, there was not a minute that they experienced internet shutdown. They could have used the excuse that, okay, Donald Trump is trying to spread wrong information online, and so we have to shut it down. No, there was never a time. They allowed for spectators to see what's going on in the US and, get proper judgments, eventually. And so nothing like this should happen. And even if the law decides, okay, there is an emergency, it should be very, very temporary. It should be for a few minutes or a few hours. We have this thing going on for an entire month in Uganda.
Again, what you should do is make provisions for essential services, just like we mentioned. So, for example, if there were a state of emergency in the country, right? say in a country, imagine if insecurity was so bad and the government declares a state of emergency, which state of emergency basically means overriding the constitution to take drastic, arbitrary decisions because it is necessary. So what you do is, for example, you could say it's unconstitutional, but we have to deploy military personnel all across the country because there's so much chaos and protest or uprising. When things get back to normal, we'll go back to constitutional processes. Even in that situation, you let essential and emergency service delivery persons move. So, in other words, you allow ambulances go pick up people who have a medical emergency. 911 is allowed to move.
But the question is, how do you even get to communicate with these guys when there's a complete blackout?
No, so that's what I'm saying. So I'm giving a very relatable example right now. So even in that situation, as a matter of fact, even in small-scale war situations, there's always provision for essential services, food supply, medical supply, water supply, catering to kids and babies. So same should apply to whatever internet shutdown or censorship you're trying to do. You have to make provision for these guys to be able to work.
True.
So again, financial transactions, online financial transactions. Even there's also virtual health delivery services. People can consult doctors virtually. So somebody's managing a chronic case, for example, and cannot have the usual doctor's appointment, which ordinarily has transitioned into virtual meetings because they can no longer go to the hospitals because of coronavirus. And now I can't talk to my doctor because the government has shut down the internet. So, like you said, what the point I'm trying to make is, if it has to happen, which I don't think there's any argument that will convince me.
It should be narrowly targeted, at least.
It should be narrowly targeted, and you must make provisions for other essential services not to suffer. People's livelihood.
It's just never defensible. Shutting down the whole country's internet completely, news sites, emails, and all. It's never defensible.
Only in Africa.
Only in Africa. They need to define limits, and this is where international bodies come to play. International monitoring and activist campaigns, come to play. It was really disappointing how the UN did nothing about what went down in Uganda, and at the end of the day, they'll be like, okay, we do not want to interfere in your political space. But that's why you're there, to defend those people who cannot actually fight for themselves at times like this.
And to be fair, most times the UN likes to take time. They like to do their preliminary investigation and also see areas to come in. Also, most times the UN intervention is basically America intervening. A lot of African countries have said every time the US comes in, things get worse. Nothing happens. It's almost an uprising. They trigger sponsor wars and stuff like that, right? However, another thing I wanted to point out was, at some point, there just has to be interventions. That's just the truth. There has to be interventions because things cannot continue to go on like that. And even so another big point is, even in a more conservative communist system like you have in China and other parts of Asia, they don't just shut off everybody. What China would do, for example, is shut out some platforms for theirs to grow. So, for example, they have the alternative to Google. So they'd rather say, you know what? No, let's have our platforms grow. Let's have more of our Android platforms or Android phones and devices rather than push the iPhone, right? So they do that. Or if a platform like TikTok seems to, pose a threat to national security, they could have, limited access or some kind of censorship, or they would have their own version that would, be better for everybody against completely shutting down access to all these platforms and all these apps.
Now, what about the telecom providers? It's understandable when government officials come to them and say, okay, we want you to shut down your operations for a month. Do they have no right at all to, say, okay, we cannot do this? Or isn't there like a legal backing?
That's a fantastic point and a fantastic question. I think that they're just scared of, government clampdown. Every investor wants to be in the good books of the sitting government. You want a situation where the government doesn't antagonize you. So I think that's the problem. And to be honest, I had even brought this up because a similar thing happened in Nigeria, where you have the government giving directive to telecom operators to blacklist certain platforms and certain sites and sources. And that's also abuse. So why do you do that? Why do you target people? So it doesn't make any sense.
All right, I think we have our guests now. Of course, we're talking about internet shutdown across Africa at this point. Why is that the case, and what can be done? We've got spokespeople from IDC, Jonathan Tullett, the research manager, IT services for IDC Sub-Saharan Africa, and Francis Hook, the regional manager, IDC East Africa.
Right.
Hello, good morning. It's good to have you here. So sorry for that back and forth with connection there. So just the background before we get into the internet shutdown communication now. I mean, it's been 1 year of the pandemic. Would like to know what the impact has been on internet usage and, of course, the adoption of technology over the last 1 year.
Well, it's been tremendous. One of the phenomena that came directly out of the response to the pandemic was the acceleration of the use of cloud technologies and mobile technologies right across the region as well as across the world, to be honest. From large organizations pushing out their workforces to be remote, to small entrepreneurs who were taking advantage of technologies to adapt their businesses to the very tough market conditions. So I think now is a particularly poignant time. Many societies are directly leveraging those technologies to survive and to get through the pandemic.
So on the cost of internet across the continent, what is the current average cost? What can we look at in terms of, reduction in the cost of internet access? We're talking about this a couple of minutes ago on the show.
In a nutshell, I think I could summarize it as too damn high. It varies obviously a huge amount from country to country, from technology to technology, whether you're talking about access to mobile technology, access to high-speed fiber technology. But one thing that is consistent is that we're relying more and more on these technologies. If you look at the role that mobile technology plays, and Francis can give you some insight specifically into what's happening in East Africa here, we're seeing this tremendous adoption of technologies which rely on the access to the internet, access to bandwidth, access to connectivity. Because it's so pervasive and because it's so empowering, it's just as important to make sure that it's also democratic, right? That it's available to everybody. One of the things that it's important to avoid in the situation is that kind of digital divide, whether it's economic, whether it's cultural, whatever it may be. You don't want to have a situation where the technology halves end up with sort of an unsustainable advantage over the technology have-nots. And again, we're in a situation where access to things like distance learning and government services through technology are particularly important. And actually, that's an area where many African countries have done particularly well in the last year compared to some parts of Southeast Asia or South America, for example, where they've had more difficulties. So we're doing well in some respects, but the costs are still too high, the reach is still too limited, and as we're talking about today, it's fairly vulnerable to interference.
All right, another very important question. So we talked about this, and we are of the opinion that it is outright abuse. When this flagrant and blatant shutdown of internet services, especially in some parts of Africa, happens. Now, why do we have a situation where there are no concessions for important services, for example, financial services? When you totally and outrightly shut down the internet access, people cannot also access financial services. They can't do international transactions. They can't send money in cases of an emergency. Do we have any reason why? Is there any reason why the governments of these countries don't even put these into consideration when they make these decisions?
I can give you a couple of reasons, but they're not good ones. So the first one is the reason that basically all governments have to exert this kind of control in the first place, which is usually framed as national security, right? So in the event that a country's internet is under attack by a foreign adversary, they need to have the ability to shut off access to protect themselves, which is kind of a hypothetical scenario that nobody's ever actually had to leverage, but it's there. The other is the requirements for interception and monitoring, which is something that is always baked into Telecom's licensing. So it's the ability to intercept and monitor for security and surveillance and law enforcement. So there's that ability, and it usually stems from the same place. And then more recently, the argument is against specific services.
Right.
So forcing citizens away from areas where there may be a great deal of potentially damaging misinformation, for example. And the US right now is kind of the poster child for this in action. And there's a lot of debates about whether it's appropriate to kick people off social networks and so on. So those are the excuses that will come up. But none of them in themselves justify switching off an entire country's internet infrastructure when, as you point out, you have services that people rely on to survive.
Right, absolutely.
Whether that's access to financial services, business services, and healthcare and education, and many services. So switching off the whole lot is very heavy-handed, and it does raise a lot of eyebrows when it happens. But to get back to one of the questions you asked specifically, no, there isn't at the moment that I know of in any country's legislation the requirement that it be weighed against the economic or any other kind of damage to the community.
Right. And so we've seen how huge the loss is, the economic damage that's caused by a shutdown in access to the internet. I'm just wondering, is this loss irrevocable, or can a country actually recover the money or the loss of income, afterwards, after it's restored?
No, I don't think you can. And first of all, I think the economic loss is sort of undercooked when you see the descriptions of it, because it generally fails to take into account the accelerating effect of it. So if you set an investor back by a year, they lose that compounded benefit over time. I think the same thing applies here. And almost by definition, you can't get it back, because if you hadn't lost it in the first place, you would be in a strong position going forwards. So I don't think you can get it back. Just how serious an impact it has on your economy versus the argument that a government would make, which is that, well, if we hadn't done it, the impact would have been worse.
All right, so over to you, Francis Hook. Now, I would like to know, the way forward. This is going to still happen. I'm very sure it's still going to happen on and on and on, even after now. But what's the way forward?
Thank you. I wanted to touch on a few aspects which may perhaps also allow us to discuss the way forward.
Right.
You were talking about the justification, and Jonathan mentioned the issue about national security. These operators who are asked to shut down, in their licenses, there is a clause where they have to always be compliant when national security issues are raised. In some cases, like Jonathan said, it's justified whenever you want to stem the flow of misinformation or, to try and contain a situation before it gets out of hand. So there is a certain degree of, basis for that kind of shutdown. But nonetheless, I think our topic today has to do with what the impact of the internet shutdown has been.
Mm-hmm.
So just from a regulatory point of view, it's just good to bear in mind that many of these licenses have a clause in some form or the other, which require operators to be compliant with government directives under national security directives. So that's on the regulatory point of view. Then talking about, if I could also just weigh in on the question about, can these costs be recouped? I agree with John. We can't really recoup. It's like skipping breakfast and having 2 breakfasts tomorrow. It's really not really going to help. For people who had to do something today on the internet, whether it's a business deal, yes, they could still try and catch up with it tomorrow, or they might miss out on it. Or if it's everyday costs that the operators expect to accrue revenue from. So when you think about return on investment periods, sometimes these small blips that can actually cause an operator to lose a lot of revenue. not just from its subscribers, but also in the periphery when you think about other services they're hosting on their network. So I think the way forward would involve really a very robust discussion, because primarily when you hear people talking about internet shutdowns, the first thing people talk about is democracy and human rights,
exactly,
and of course the economic impact. But what motivates the shutdown for those countries where there may be a basis to stem the flow of disinformation? What recourse do they have? I think regulators should now weigh in, and especially since regulators are supposed to be really independent, to advise the governments that, okay, these are the ways you can, control the flow of information or misinformation, if you like. Perhaps blocking certain IP addresses and not others, so that you keep you keep the economy running while trying to achieve that one objective. And of course, in principle, this sounds like something that can happen, but the motivation, that motivation is always more often than not a pretext. It's not really the real motivation behind the shutdown. It's to prevent mobilization, discourse, debate, and so on. And talking of mobilization, even in some countries, they have shut down mobile payments because they see money flowing around as another way people can be mobilized to move from area to area. So in some cases, they actually impact mobile payments, whether it's the normal way carried over networks using USSD or via mobile applications. So I think there's need for regulators to step forward and look at how to, what the justification is, and how to really how to address that justification without affecting the broader economy. Indeed, it also flies in the face of efforts by regulators. Most regulators, and I'll just limit myself to Africa, most regulators have the mandate to increase penetration. People talk about universal access, and one overarching thing has to do with healthcare, education, agriculture, small businesses. So on one hand, the regulator has a big fund where they're trying to expand access to fixed voice, to fixed internet, mobile voice, mobile internet. But then their efforts are more or less being laid to waste once they've achieved these objectives of connecting rural areas, working in partnerships with different players to, avail access for education, healthcare, emergencies, and so on. And then now, the governments are shutting down the internet. So there's sort of some erosion there, or rather the carpet is sort of being pulled from under the regulators who are mandated to increase access. So again, I think regulators should step forward, engage with the policymakers, and perhaps also do an assessment of the impact. Some of the impact is very patently clear in terms of the revenue lost by operators, in terms of the businesses losing out on communications, international communications of whatever form. But there are other areas, and I think John alluded to this briefly, in terms of cloud services. Many companies are using cloud services which more often than not are hosted outside the country. Whether it's a customer relationship management, whether it's enterprise resource planning, human resources, payroll, all the way, affecting big enterprises all the way to small businesses, which just need some basic financial accounting system. So there's that knock that happens. So if your business is disrupted for 4 to 5 days, as recently happened in Uganda, then you're more inclined to, shy away from your business. If you rely on this, whenever there's a shutdown, you're going to be deprived of certain tools that you need to run your business.
Right. So, yeah, I'm still on the way forward. You mentioned some very important points. However, so I was going to say, I think the major problem is when these governments take these drastic actions, they almost leave no room for negotiation or conversation, right? And then a lot of the owners of these service providers sometimes are scared to even, speak up because they don't want to be antagonized by the government, and they don't also want drastic sanctions. So how do we create that opportunity for even an audience or listening ear from the government? How do we get the government to sit down with operators and regulators to say, okay, you know what, this is absolute, but we need to factor in small enterprises, we need to factor in emergency services, just like we had highlighted and Jonathan had also touched on. Also, when you talk about sovereignty and abuse of human rights, is there a way we could get continental bodies, say the African Union, for example, to come in and speak on behalf of these people? So at least there could be a chance to even have a conversation before, just arbitrarily shutting down the internet.
It's a great question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Short answer, yes. Long answer, it's yes, but it's super hard, right? So first of all, you got to remember that in most cases, when an internet shutdown takes effect, it's done so without warning.
Exactly.
So it's done so without the opportunity to engage, and part of that is because governments who want to shut down the internet are generally doing it for some quite specific purpose, and it's typically political. So they are trying to silence dissent or control a conversation in some way that's drawing attention to the fact that they're going to do it would only give people warning and the opportunity to circumvent it. And we've seen, even going right back to the Arab Spring, where the Egyptian internet was cut off, and Egyptian citizens, you've got to remember, again, they're motivated to communicate, so they will find a way. They will use other technologies if necessary. They will invent other technologies to do so. So really all you're gaining as a government is that quite short period of shutdown, right as an election happens, for example, or when a particular court case is working through the system.
Right.
It's over.
All right, just to zoom out a little from the internet shutdown conversation, there happens to be a growing adoption of local data centers across Africa by large and small companies. Can you give us a bit of insight on that?
Yeah, it's actually fascinating. A lot of these operators for quite a long time, for several years, have been concerned that as the hyperscale cloud providers, so Amazon, Google, and so on, as they start to roll out and push services, we've seen Microsoft establishing data centers in Africa and so on, that it would eat into their data center business, their domestic data center business. And in actual fact, the opposite has happened. It's stimulated the growth of local data centers. We've seen the emergence of whole new types of applications which really leverage that combination of the hyperscale international cloud with local data centers.
Yeah.
We've seen some very successful local telecoms operators spreading into data center businesses and expanding. And East Africa is a fantastic example of this in action. There's tons of data center builds on the go. So it's a fantastic business to be in, and it really highlights the demand that there is for these types of services. Especially within this East African region, where there's a lot of energy in building out these types of services. And of course, just within this immediate context, it does hedge against that risk of an internet disconnection of any sort, having a local data center. But I think in most cases it's that synergy between local and global. Francis, you've got your eyes on lots of local companies out there who are very active.
Right.
Where do you see it going?
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, indeed, this is one way of partly mitigating this problem, and especially where the communications are on the continent. We've seen some players actually making investments that are actually attracting these data center providers to either build their data centers in Africa, across the continent, or work with local providers to run local instances. These are people like Google, Oracle, SAP. So one good thing that's happening is that the terrestrial networks, the land-based fiber, is continually being expanded, and at the same time, there have been a lot of initiatives at the country level and regional level for peering internet traffic. So that, for example, if I'm writing to John in Johannesburg, it doesn't have to go all the way to the submarine cables internationally and then land in Johannesburg. It can just pass over the continent using terrestrial fiber. So for intra-Africa communications, these data centers would be one way that helps to mitigate the impact of this. And more so when it comes to hosting certain cloud services, software as a service, where we have these data centers on the continent. But having said that, some of these internet shutdowns affect the international gateways. So, in a sense, if the government's intentions are to control access to social media like Twitter, WhatsApp, Facebook, and so on, there could be some ways that they can still do that without affecting other services.
Exactly.
Interesting.
For the most part, these are internationally hosted services. But for the other business-oriented education, when you think about things like Office 365, which is actually being adopted to a good extent in the education sector, then if there are local instances of these residing at data centers, then to an extent part of the problem ceases to be. So I think the more we invest in terrestrial infrastructure, the more attractive the continent becomes as a place to host data centers. But just with a small caveat that there are pockets of challenges here and there, like electricity in West Africa, which would, of course, increase the cost of running a data center using generators.
That's right.
Perhaps other renewable power. Thank you.
All right.
I mean, we have one in Cape Town I know of, the one by Amazon. And we have a few companies in Nigeria also, that build local data centers. But then what do you see 5 years from now? What should we look forward to in the next 5 years when it comes to local data centers across Africa?
What I think you're going to see, first of all, is a lot more partnerships. The arrival of Microsoft and Amazon in Africa was not, it didn't happen at the same time by accident. The market is just ready for this. So you're going to see more companies coming, and there are the obvious candidates, like Oracle and Huawei and so on, who will almost certainly be establishing facilities here. Not just in South Africa. South Africa is the largest cloud market for sure, but there are tremendous opportunities. Nigeria is a very big market. Kenya is a very large market. There are large amounts of Francophone Africa, for example. So a lot of opportunities. So partnerships you'll definitely see the local providers building out capacity for those partnerships, but also for customers who are migrating from on-premise into hosted private cloud. So in other words, taking advantage of cloud technologies, but not in your own data center on-premise. And then going forwards, as that accelerates, you'll start to see more and more of these synergies emerging, where you have, for example, cloud edge technologies. So using a lot of Internet of Things, where you're gathering data in a local data center and then handing it off to a hyperscale cloud for processing. So those types of interfaces are very important, and it really increases that demand for local in-country, very low latency facilities. So that's a big pressure that's building. At the same time, what you're going to see is the sort of upscaling of the capacity. So in other words, you look at the in-country facilities, in order to compete with each other, they have to keep going forwards. They have to keep improving their power efficiency. They have to keep improving their connectivity, reliability, and so on, right? So there is a risk that smaller providers will struggle to keep up, and the market will start to consolidate around the really big players. The incumbent, tier 3, tier 4 data center operators. Those smaller guys really have to be inventive, and they have to start now, if they haven't already, in looking for niches that they can establish to build a sustainable business. And there are opportunities out there. In just the same way that the big guys were feeling threatened by hyperscale before, and they found a good route forward, there are opportunities. So I think, data centers not an exciting topic to a lot of techies who look at the flashing lights and of public cloud, but it's right now is probably as exciting a time for the technology development and for the business opportunities as there has been in a long time.
All right, guys, still Africa Business Radio, and we have been talking to the IDC spokespersons, Jonathan Tullett, who is the research manager at IT services for IDC Sub-Saharan Africa, and of course, Francis Hook, who is regional manager for IDC East Africa. We have been discussing the impact of internet shutdowns. Thank you so much, guys, for coming to dissect this topic with us, and also, shed more light on dark areas and just, making us understand the whole concept better. Thank you so much.
Thank you.